The wine bottle was the first thing Pamela saw. Half empty, expensive, resting carelessly on the coffee table like evidence someone had forgotten to hide. Then came the silhouettes beyond the cracked door. A man leaning back against the couch. A woman curled against his chest. Candlelight flickered across their faces in soft amber waves, while slow jazz drifted through the apartment like a private confession never meant to be heard. Pamela stopped breathing. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse as the world narrowed into that single opening between the door and its frame. 2 wine glasses, 1 blanket, 1 intimate silence that told her everything words never could. The woman laughed quietly. Not loud, not forced. Comfortable. That was the part that hurt most. Pamela felt something cold slide through her chest. Not anger yet, something worse. Disbelief trying to survive reality. The man brushed a strand of hair behind the woman's ear with terrifying familiarity, and Pamela's stomach twisted violently. For a second, she almost convinced herself she was mistaken. Wrong apartment. Wrong man. Wrong night. But then he turned slightly toward the candlelight, and her heart collapsed. The hallway behind her suddenly felt endless and airless. Her pulse roared so loudly, she barely heard the soft clink of glass as the woman reached for her wine. Neither of them noticed her standing there, watching, breaking apart in complete silence. Pamela swallowed hard, but the ache in her throat only deepened. Every memory she had built around him now felt fragile enough to shatter with one touch. Inside the apartment, the candles kept burning warmly. Outside the door, Pamela felt unbearably cold. The mahogany door, heavy and indifferent, stood slightly ajar like a fracture in a reality Pamela no longer recognized. She held her breath, the metallic bite of her house keys stinging her palm as she remained paralyzed in the hallway. Through the narrow gap, the scene bled into her consciousness with agonizing clarity. On the low wooden table, a bottle of red wine stood between 2 half-filled glasses, the liquid dark and stagnant under the flicker of thick white candles. The light didn't dance. It merely clung to the shadows, illuminating a betrayal that felt ancient and settled. Gerardo sat on the velvet couch, his dark suit blending into the gloom, looking every bit the tired sovereign of a crumbling empire. But it was the way his head leaned against Catherine that shattered Pamela's composure. Catherine, dressed in her crisp staff uniform, sat with her eyes closed, her head pillowed on his shoulder in a sanctuary of silence that Pamela had believed was hers alone to provide. There was no frantic movement, no panicked untangling of limbs, only the terrifying, domestic stillness of 2 people who had found a home in one another's quiet. Pamela felt a single, hot tear track a path down her cheek, but she made no sound. She didn't push the door open to demand an explanation she already possessed. She didn't scream for the guards or shatter the wine bottle against the wall. Instead, she stepped back into the darkened hallway, her movements as fluid and ghost-like as the life she was now mourning. In the world of the mafia, a debt was rarely settled with noise. It was paid in the cold, calculated silence of a woman who had just realized she was no longer the only queen in the palace, but the most dangerous enemy within its walls. The master suite was a cavern of silk and secrets, the air thick with the oppressive luxury of a man who owned the city. Pamela lay perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the heavy, measured tread of Gerardo's footsteps approaching the bed. When the mattress dipped under his weight, she didn't flinch. He reached out, his hand sliding over the small of her back in a gesture that was supposed to be a homecoming but felt like a brand. As he leaned in to press a kiss to her shoulder, the scent hit her, not the familiar, sharp citrus of his cologne, but a soft, floral trail of jasmine and vanilla. It was Catherine's perfume, a lingering ghost of the sanctuary she had seen them sharing only hours before. "Awake," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly hum that usually acted as a balm. Tonight it made her skin crawl. He didn't pull away. Instead, he tucked a stray curl behind her ear with a tenderness that was terrifying. He was being kind, attentive in a way that suggested he was compensating for a crime he believed was still invisible. Pamela realized then that this was Gerardo at his most lethal. His cruelty was predictable, a storm you could track, but his kindness was the velvet glove hiding the iron fist. It was a tool used to lull his enemies into a false sense of safety before the strike. She forced herself to breathe, to lean into his touch like the loyal queen he expected. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a tremor or a tear. As he closed his eyes, convinced his secret was safe within the perfumed air, Pamela stared into the darkness. The shadow he cast across the bed was long and jagged, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the man. She was studying the monster, waiting for the moment his kindness would provide the very opening she needed to destroy him. A luxurious dining room filled with oppressive silence. Pamela from the reference image sits elegantly at the long dining table while Catherine, a beautiful young house staff member, quietly pours wine nearby. Gerardo sits at the head of the table, dominant and unreadable. Pamela watches Catherine intensely with piercing eyes, noticing every movement like a predator studying prey. The atmosphere feels psychologically suffocating. Soft chandelier lighting contrasts with dark shadows around the room. Catherine avoids eye contact while tension hangs heavily in the air. Rich mafia mansion aesthetic with polished marble, gold accents, and emotional warfare beneath perfect appearances. Style tags. Cinematic dinner tension, luxury mansion interior, psychological thriller, mafia family atmosphere, elegant fashion, emotional hostility, realistic lighting, Korean drama cinematography. The silence of the house became Pamela's greatest ally, a hollow space she filled with the cold blue light of a hidden laptop. Sitting in the sanctuary of her private study, she let the persona of the grieving partner fall away, replaced by the lethal precision of the international trade consultant she had always been. Her fingers flew across the keys, bypassing encrypted firewalls and navigating the labyrinthine corridors of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. Gerardo was meticulous, but he had taught her too well. He had forgotten that he wasn't the only one in the house who knew how to hide a fortune in plain sight. As the spreadsheets scrolled by, a pattern began to emerge, a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led away from the mafia's usual illicit ports and directly into a series of trust funds. Pamela's breath hitched when she saw the name attached to the newest accounts, Catherine Padilla. It wasn't just small sums for jewelry or silence. These were massive, recurring transfers disguised as logistics payments. Catherine wasn't just a mistress tucked away in a staff uniform. She was being positioned as a beneficiary, a primary stakeholder in a side of Gerardo's empire that Pamela had been systematically locked out of. The realization was a physical blow. The sanctuary she had witnessed through the door wasn't an impulsive lapse in judgment. It was a transition. Gerardo wasn't just betraying her heart. He was re-engineering the very foundations of his legacy, moving the pillars of his wealth from Pamela's hands to Catherine's. She stared at the glowing screen, the numbers reflecting in her dark eyes like stars in a cold sea. The affair was the smoke, but the paperwork was the fire. She didn't close the laptop. Instead, she began to download, her silence transforming from a shield into a ledger of war. The dining room was a theater of shadows, the air heavy with the scent of roasted meat and the metallic tang of unspoken accusations. Gerardo sat across from Pamela, the flickering candlelight carving deep, jagged hollows into his face. He didn't eat. Instead, he swirled his wine, his gaze fixed on her with a sudden, unnerving intensity. For years, Pamela had navigated his moods like a seasoned sailor, but tonight the wind had shifted. The silence between them wasn't the comfortable quiet of partners. It was the pressurized stillness that precedes a landslide. "Been remarkably composed lately, Pamela," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat. He set his glass down with a precise click that echoed against the obsidian table. "Usually, when I am this busy, you grow restless. Yet you seem settled, almost as if you found a new project to occupy your mind." Pamela met his stare, her heart a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs, yet her face remained as smooth as polished jade. She took a slow, deliberate bite of her salad, savoring the bitter crunch of the greens before responding. "I've simply realized that peace is a luxury I shouldn't squander, Gerardo. Is that a crime in this house?" His eyes narrowed, tracking the steady movement of her hands. He was hunting for a tremor, a tell, a single crack in the regal mask she had worn since that night by the mahogany door. "In our world, peace is often a mask for a different kind of labor," he countered, the subtext of his words cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. He leaned forward, the heat of his suspicion radiating across the table. For a heartbeat, Pamela feared he could see the digital ghosts of his offshore accounts reflected in her pupils. She didn't blink. She offered him a thin, practiced smile, the kind a queen gives a courtier she is about to exile, and reached for her wine, realizing that the dance had moved from the shadows into the light. The confrontation didn't happen in the grand foyer or under the watchful eyes of the security cameras. It happened in the cramped, windowless laundry room, amidst the hum of industrial dryers and the steam of Gerardo's pressed shirts. Catherine was folding linen, her movements robotic and drained of the grace she displayed in Gerardo's presence. When Pamela stepped into the room, the girl's shoulders seized, a visible shiver of terror passing through her small frame. She dropped a silk pillowcase, her eyes widening as she looked for an exit that didn't exist. "Don't," Pamela said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through the mechanical noise. "I'm not here to play the part of the scorned wife. I've seen the trust accounts, Catherine. I know the price he's putting on your head." Catherine's knees seemed to buckle. She sank onto a wooden stool, her face losing what little color it had. "It isn't what you think," she whispered, the classic lie dying on her lips as she looked at Pamela's unshakable expression. "He doesn't give you a choice. He found my brother in the debt pits. He told me if I stayed, if I kept him quiet, that my family would be safe. The money isn't for me. I can't touch a cent of it without his signature." Anger that had been simmering in Pamela's chest for weeks suddenly turned into a cold, hollow empathy. She saw the bruises hidden beneath the collar of the staff uniform, faint, yellowing fingerprints on Catherine's collarbone. The girl wasn't a successor or a conqueror. She was a hostage draped in jasmine perfume and expensive promises. Gerardo hadn't built a sanctuary, he had simply expanded his cage. Pamela reached out, not to strike, but to steady the girl's trembling hand. They were two different points on the same jagged map, both held captive by a man who treated love like a strategic acquisition. The silence between them shifted then, no longer a barrier, but a bridge built of shared, desperate survival. The decision to dismantle Gerardo's world was not born of heat, but of a freezing, absolute clarity. Pamela moved through the estate like a ghost in the machine, her every gesture a masterpiece of domestic normalcy, while her mind operated with the lethal efficiency of a grandmaster. She knew the rhythm of Gerardo's security details, the blind spots in his digital surveillance, and the specific, ego-driven cracks in his alliances. To secure her freedom, she didn't need a gun. She needed a scalpel, and she found it in the high-frequency trading logs and port manifestos she had decrypted in the dead of night. The leaks began as whispers, an anonymous tip to the Morty family about a delayed shipment in Busan, a lost ledger sent to a disgruntled lieutenant in the Sinchon district. Pamela didn't flood the market with his secrets. She fed the chaos in increments, watching from the periphery as Gerardo's normally ironclad composure began to fray. She sat beside him at gala events, her hand resting gracefully on his arm, feeling the tension vibrating through his tailored suit as his phone buzzed with news of another, unforeseen logistical disaster. Every move was a calculated risk, a gamble played on the razor's edge of discovery. She was no longer just his partner. She was the architect of his decline, methodically pulling the pins from the grenades he had spent a lifetime priming. As his rivals grew bolder and his internal circle began to whisper of a rat in the ranks, Pamela remained the picture of the devoted, oblivious queen. She was creating a storm large enough to provide the cover she needed to vanish, realizing that the only way to truly survive a monster was to ensure he was too busy fighting his own shadow to notice yours slipping out the door. The grand ballroom was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, a cathedral of predatory wealth where the air hummed with the nervous energy of men who knew the tides were turning. Gerardo moved through the crowd like a wounded lion, his jaw set in a permanent line of tension as he fielded questions about the recent logistical failures plaguing his ports. Beside him, Pamela was a vision of devastating elegance in a gown the color of a bruise, her hand alight, anchoring weight on his arm. She played the part of the supportive consort to perfection, yet beneath the surface, she was the conductor of a silent orchestra. Tonight, the ghost would finally take form. As the clock struck midnight, The digital seeds she had planted weeks ago began to bloom simultaneously across the private tablets and secure phones of every associate in the room. It wasn't a crude dump of data. It was a curated exhibition of Gerardo's vulnerability. In between the records of the trust funds he had funneled to Catherine, she had woven evidence of his secret negotiations with the very rivals he had promised to crush. The shift in the room was physical, a sudden drop in temperature. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads bowed over glowing screens. Pamela watched the realization dawn on Gerardo's face as he saw the loyal lieutenants he had stepped on start to exchange looks of calculated betrayal. She leaned in close, her lips almost brushing his ear, the scent of her perfume momentarily drowning out the smell of his impending ruin. "The problem with building a house of cards, Gerardo," she whispered, her voice a silk thread in the cacophony of his collapsing world, "is that eventually the wind finds its way inside." She didn't wait for his reaction. She simply turned and began to walk away, a ghost finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light. The air outside the gala was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating mix of expensive tobacco and betrayal she had left behind. Behind the heavy oak doors, the silence of the room had been replaced by a low, predatory roar as the men Gerardo once commanded realized their king was naked. Pamela didn't look back to see him. She didn't need to. She could already imagine him standing in the center of that ballroom, a man who had spent his life mastering the shadows, finally realizing he had been outplayed by the one person he thought he had successfully silenced. She walked toward the waiting car, her heels clicking against the pavement with the steady, rhythmic beat of a clock ticking toward a new era. In her hand, she held a single-burner phone. One press of a button sent the final encryption key to Catherine, unlocking the funds that would disappear into a dozen untraceable accounts, enough for the girl to disappear, enough to buy the safety of a family Gerardo had used as a leash. The debt was settled. As the city lights of Seoul blurred into long, neon streaks through the car window, Pamela finally allowed the tension in her shoulders to dissolve. For months, she had been a ghost in her own life, a silent witness to her own displacement. But as the car sped toward the airport, the silence she had carried no longer felt like a weight, it felt like a foundation. Gerardo had taught her that power was found in what you could control, but as she watched the sunrise begin to bleed over the Han River, Pamela knew the truth. Real power was the ability to walk away from everything you had built to save the only thing that mattered, yourself. The future didn't sound like the roar of an empire. It sounded like the quiet, steady breath of a woman who was finally, undeniably, free.